Echoes in the Deep Brine, Chapter 2, The Disharmonious Song. The silence was the loudest thing in the room. It pressed in, a physical weight on the eardrums, made all the heavier by the memory of the noise it had replaced. For 3 standard cycles, the protein refinery had been a bedlam of cacophony. 112 voices locked in a discordant looping chant that had bled through every bulkhead and driven the perimeter bards to the edge of metal hum madness. Now, nothing. Joran Vask stood before the triple-paned polymer glass of the observation post, his reflection a pale, gaunt specter against the impossible scene within. His knuckles were white where he gripped the data slate. The air in the mobile command unit was thick with the scent of overworked servers and ozone, a sterile counterpoint to the ever-present low-tide brine of Haven that seeped through even the most advanced filtration systems. A rhythmic drip, drip, drip of condensation from a ceiling conduit somewhere behind him was the only percussion in the crushing quiet. "It stopped 27 minutes ago," Brecker-Hune said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to be absorbed by the sound-dampening panels. The enforcer stood a respectful 2 paces back, a solid mass of muscle and augmented sinew, clad in the dark gray fatigues of Hydrocorpus security. His presence was usually a comfort, a predictable variable. Tonight, it felt useless. "I have a chronometer, Brecker," Joran replied, not taking his eyes off the refinery floor. The clinical curiosity that had fueled him for days was curdling in his gut, transmuting into something cold and heavy. Dread. Where there had been chaos, there was now a terrifying, orderly beauty. The chanting had stopped, but a new phenomenon had taken its place. A soft, rhythmic pulse of light emanated from the center of the vast chamber. It was a bioluminescent glow, the sickly green-blue of deep-sea fungi, but it moved with the coordinated precision of a single organism. The light swelled, held for a 2-second count, and then receded, plunging the chamber into near darkness before beginning the cycle anew. It was like watching a city breathe. "What is it?" Brecker asked, stepping forward to stand beside Joran. "Some kind of coordinated signal?" "It's a symptom," Joran said automatically, the dogma of his profession, a shield against the awe-inspiring wrongness of the view. He forced his attention down to the data slate in his hands. He needed numbers. He needed data points he could classify, categorize, and ultimately pathologize. He swiped a thumb across the screen, initiating a spectral analysis. A jagged, nonsensical waveform appeared, flickering erratically. A red banner blinked at the top of the display. "Error. Paradoxical waveform detected." He ran it again. Same result. "Rust rot," he muttered. His tools, the very extensions of his rational mind, were failing. "Problems, Vask?" "The readings are contradictory." Joran zoomed in on a specific data cluster, his brow furrowing. "The primary emission registers as a bioluminary event, consistent with certain fungal blooms found in the stillness, but it's layered with a thermal signature that suggests intense heat and an electromagnetic frequency that my slate is tagging as data interruption." He felt a prickle of sweat on his neck. It wasn't data corruption. The machine was doing exactly what it was designed to do, report what it saw. The problem was that what it saw shouldn't exist. He tapped another function, trying to isolate the sonic component. The chanting was gone, but his audio sensors insisted there was a sound, a deep, resonant thrumming on the absolute lowest edge of human hearing. Query: frequency below 20 Hz. Classification: subsonic/geological. He could feel it more than he could hear it, a vibration that seemed to travel up through the soles of his boots, through the grated metal floor, a hum that settled deep in his bone marrow. It synced perfectly with the pulsing light, a silent, subsonic choir. "The workers," Brecker said, his face pressed close to the glass. "Where are they?" Joran magnified the primary view, the image on his slate sharpening. He panned across the refinery floor. The nutrient paste vats, the reclamation conduits, the hulking protein synthesizers, all were woven into a new, grotesque architecture. What looked like coral or perhaps fungal mycelium had grown over everything, its structure pulsing with that same soft light. The patterns were intricate, fractal, disturbingly organic. And there, within the lattices, were the workers.
They were no longer chanting. They were no longer moving. They were part of it. A man Joran recognized from the personnel files, a refinery tech named Kalen, was fused to the side of a massive processing vat. His arms were outstretched, and the bioluminescent growth had erupted from his skin, encasing him in a crystalline shell that followed the lines of his circulatory system. His flesh and the corroded metal of the vat were no longer distinct entities, they had merged. The light pulsed from within his chest, a soft, steady heartbeat of blue-green energy. "Gods of the deep brine," Brecker breathed, stepping back from the window. The enforcer, a man who had seen the worst of bellows-level violence, looked pale. Joran felt a cold wave of something akin to vertigo. His mind scrabbled for a rational explanation. Massive fungal outbreak, hallucinogenic spores altering perception. The fusion is an optical illusion caused by the light and the crystalline growth over their bodies. He typed furiously into the slate's analysis field. Subject: biological mechanical fusion. Cross-reference: genetic mutation, metallurgical corrosion, spore-induced crystallization. The slate processed for a moment, its internal fans whirring, then flashed another error. Error: insufficient data. Phenomenon defies known biological and physical laws. Defies known laws. The phrase echoed in his mind, mocking his entire worldview. Laws were not meant to be defied. They were absolute. He was a forensic theologian. He deconstructed belief systems, exposed their fraudulent miracles, and reduced gods to psychological artifacts and environmental triggers. But this was not a shared delusion. This was a shared reality, one that was overwriting the old one. The chanting hadn't just been a symptom of a sickness. It had been the sound of construction. "It's a shrine," Joran heard himself say, the word tasting like blasphemy on his tongue. They didn't just go mad. They built something. "They became something," Brecker corrected, his voice grim. "Vask, this is beyond a mental hygiene issue. This isn't a cult. It's an infestation." Joran didn't answer. He was staring at the central point of the pulsing light. A cluster of what had once been a dozen workers was now a single, towering pillar of glowing, coral-like material, intricately carved with patterns that seemed to shift and rearrange themselves between pulses of light. It looked like a throne, an empty one.
The thrumming in the floor intensified for a moment, a low groan of stressed metal that vibrated through Joran's teeth. The clinical detachment he had so carefully cultivated was gone, stripped away by the silent pulsing light and the slate in his hands that kept telling him one simple, terrifying truth. I don't know. For the first time since he lost his family, since he dedicated his life to the cold, hard logic of disbelief, Joran Vask felt the unmistakable primal chill of confronting a god he couldn't debunk, and it was far more terrifying than the mindless chanting of its followers. The command tent was an illusion of sterility, a thin polymer membrane separating Joran from the cascading rust and rot of the bellows. Inside, the air was scrubbed clean, carrying only the sharp, sterile scent of ozone from the humming data spire and the faint metallic tang of his own recycled breath. Outside, the perpetual drip of condensation echoed against the tent's taut skin, a constant maddening metronome counting down to some unseen collapse. With all due respect, Liaison Varro, your neurotoxin theory is a masterpiece of bureaucratic fiction. Joran's voice was a low rasp, scraped raw by fatigue and contempt. He paced the 3 meters of grated floor, his boots clanging a restless rhythm. On the central holodisplay, the liaison's face, smooth and unlined from a life in the Arium's filtered air, remained placid. Dr. Vask, the voice crackled through the calm, devoid of emotion. The directorate's position is that maintaining public calm is paramount. The neurotoxin narrative is effective. It provides a rational, containable threat. It's a lie, Joran snapped, stopping to glare at the shimmering face. A lie that will get more people killed. A toxin doesn't create this. He jabbed a finger at a secondary screen. It showed a live feed from a drone hovering outside the sealed protein refinery. The view was dominated by the Shrine, a pulsating mass of fused metal and organic matter that had once been a processing vat, and 24 workers. It glowed with a sickeningly beautiful, soft green light, pulsing in a slow, steady rhythm, like a monstrous heart. The luminescence is an anomalous biochemical reaction, Varro recited, his eyes not quite meeting the camera. A side effect of the contaminant interacting with the refinery's nutrient medium. Joran let out a harsh, dry laugh. A side effect? Liaison, the light is pulsing at exactly 72 beats per minute. So are the heart rates of every quarantined worker we have on remote biomonitors. Their neural activity, their respiratory cycles, everything. It's synchronized. A chemical doesn't conduct a choir. This is a mimetic contagion expressing a coherent, organized pathology. My field, not yours. He was projecting. He knew it. The ghost of Olena IV, of the sun gazer's perfectly synchronized march into the plasma fire, flickered at the edge of his vision. The guilt was a physical weight pressing on his chest, making the humid air feel even heavier. He had tried to be rational then, too. He had written reports while his family burned. "Your mandate, Doctor," Varro said, his voice hardening slightly, "is to provide a psychosocial analysis that supports the Directorate's containment strategy, not to formulate alternative hypotheses. Stick to the script. The script is wrong. Then you are to find a way to make it right. Keep your footing, Doctor." The connection severed, plunging the tent into a sudden oppressive silence. Varro's face dissolved into a shower of blue pixels, leaving Joran alone with the hum of the machines and the rhythmic drip, drip, drip from the world outside.
"Rust rot," he whispered, the curse tasting like bile.
He ran a hand over his face, the stubble rasping against his palm. The dread was a cold slickness in his gut. Varro wasn't just a fool, he was a symptom of the Directorate's terminal disease. The belief that any truth could be managed, massaged, and repackaged for public consumption. They saw belief as a data point to be controlled, not a force of nature. Jaron turned away from the blank screen, his full attention drawn to the data spire. He spread his hands, and the holographic interface expanded around him, bathing him in a cold blue and green light. He dismissed the live feed of the shrine. Its hypnotic pulse was unsettling his focus. He called up the raw sensor data from the last 12 hours. On one side of the display, he pulled up the energy signature from the refinery. A jagged, rhythmic waveform, a visual representation of the thrumming that now saturated the entire sector. He could feel it through the soles of his boots, a low-frequency vibration that seemed to be trying to shake his teeth loose. It was the chanting sickness given a voice of groaning steel. On the other side, he isolated a deeper, more fundamental frequency. He filtered out the noise of the bellows, the roar of reclamation grinders, the hiss of steam vents, the chatter of a million desperate lives. He went deeper, pulling from seismic sensors embedded in the arcology's primary pylons, the titanic legs that sank into the black, crushing pressure of the stillness. And there it was, the metal hum. The ever-present, low guttural groan of Haven itself. Locals said it caused madness. Jaron had always dismissed it as simple acoustic stress. The two waveforms moved on his display, independent, chaotic. The metal hum was a long, slow sine wave, the bass note of their world. The refinery's thrum was a frantic, spiky rhythm. He watched them, his mind racing through rationalizations. Structural resonance. The initial event at the refinery damaged a support, creating a feedback loop with the pylon's natural frequency. The low-frequency sound is inducing auditory hallucinations in a stressed populace, classic environmental trigger from mass psychogenic illness. It was a clean, logical model, a viral idea spreading through a population primed for delusion by their hellish environment. It fit his life's work. It was containable. He ran a comparative analysis, commanding the spire to overlay the two signals, the system word rendering the data, the two waveforms, one from the deep foundation, one from the localized outbreak, slid over each other. For a moment, they were a mess of conflicting lines. Then the algorithm found the pattern, and Jaron's breath caught in his throat. They were syncing. It wasn't a simple echo or a feedback loop. The refinery's frantic, jagged pulse was beginning to match the phase and period of the deep, slow metal hum. It was like watching a panicked, racing heart learn, beat by beat, to match the slow, deliberate rhythm of a drum. The thrum from the shrine wasn't just noise. It was tuning itself. It was learning. The neat clinical box he had built around the phenomenon shattered. The cold dread in his gut blossomed into something colder, sharper. This wasn't a flaw in the machine. This was a signal. Observation was no longer a scientific methodology. It was an act of cowardice. Staring at data while the disease evolved was how he had failed before. His frustration hardened into a new, grim determination. He couldn't dissect a waveform. He couldn't put a frequency on a microscope slide. The faith wasn't just the symptom of the virus, it was the virus. And he needed a host. He needed to isolate one of them, cut them off from this this choir. He needed to see what the belief looked like when it was alone, trapped in a single mind. He had to prove to himself, before the last of his sanity frayed, that it was just a delusion, that it could be broken. He strode to the secure comm panel, his movements stiff, deliberate. He bypassed the directorate channels, keying in the encrypted frequency for his security detail. The connection chimed once. "Brecker," Joran said, his voice flat and hard as reclaimed steel. The rhythmic pulsing from the refinery seemed to mock him, a steady beat of a clock he could no longer ignore. "The theory of containment is over. We're moving to vivisection. Find me a believer. I want one alive." The airlock's locking lugs disengaged with a series of percussive clunks, each one echoing down the sterile access corridor like a gavel striking stone. A final, prolonged hiss of equalizing pressure bled into the recycled air, and then silence. Through the thick polymer glass of his helmet, Joran Vask watched the heavy inner door of the bellows-level refinery begin its slow, groaning retreat into the wall. His own resolve felt just as solid, just as heavy. This was a box. A contaminated box, yes, but a known quantity. A protein refinery, sealed for a hygiene protocol after the neurotoxin event. The workers were contained. The systems were offline. His job was to step inside, catalog the breakdown, identify the source of the mass delusion, the environmental trigger for the cognitive virus, and write the final, rational report. It was a formula he knew. It was a comfort. "Seals are green, sir. Ready when you are." Brecker Hune's voice crackled in his ear, a low burr of professionalism layered over a dampskin's pragmatism. The man was a walking contradiction of corporate loyalty and bellows grit, his augmented frame a silhouette of brutal efficiency beside Joran. "Acknowledged, Brecker. Keep your footing. Standard sweep pattern." Joran replied, his own voice sounding distant, clinical. He stepped over the raised threshold, his mag-soled boots making a soft clack on the grated floor of the decontamination chamber. He expected cold. He expected the astringent, nose-burning scent of chemical sterilization agents used to scrub every surface after a shift. He expected the dry, biting chill of an industrial refrigeration system on standby. He got none of it. The air that greeted him was a physical presence. It was warm, thick, and profoundly wet, clinging to the exterior of his environment suit like a feverish skin. It was the oppressive, lung-heavy humidity of the deepest, most neglected levels of the arcology, a place where water wept perpetually from rusted ceilings. But this was a sealed facility in the upper bellows. It made no sense. Then came the smell. It pushed through his helmet's sophisticated filtration system, not as a distinct scent, but as a phantom on the edge of perception. Ozone, sharp and electric, like failing circuitry. And beneath it, something ancient and organic. The profound, mineral-rich smell of deep-sea brine and the low-tide decay of kelp. It was the smell of the stillness. Joran froze. His gloved hand, which had been reaching for the control panel on his wrist, paused mid-air. His mind, a machine built for logical disassembly, began to spin, running through diagnostic protocols. Hull breach? Unlikely. The external pressure sensors would have triggered a dozen alarms. HVAC system failure? Possible. A coolant leak could raise the humidity, but it wouldn't explain the salinity. Contamination from the water reclamation system? Plausible, But that water was purified to the molecule. It had no scent. "Rust rot," Brecker muttered, his helmet lamp cutting a sharp white cone through the inky blackness. "What is that? Smells like my granduncle's fungal farm after a pipe burst." He took a heavy step forward, and his boot slid. A wet, slick sound echoed in the sudden quiet. "Floor's greasy. Watch yourself." Joran aimed his own lamp downwards. The grated metal floor of the decontamination chamber, designed for drainage and grip, was coated in a viscous, perfectly clear fluid. It wasn't oil. It wasn't water. It pooled in shallow, trembling dishes, the light from their lamps passing through it without distortion. But where the fluid was thickest, it seemed to resist forming ripples. When Joran shifted his foot, the liquid yielded slowly, like cold syrup, before pulling itself back together with an unnatural smoothness. The description from the forbidden logs flickered in his mind unbidden. The water doesn't ripple correctly. He suppressed the thought with practiced violence. Existential contagion, that's what the directorate called it. Reading unredacted data, allowing it to infect your rational processes. This was a chemical spill, some pre-cascade polymer reacting with the high humidity. There was always an explanation. Log the environmental conditions, Brecker. Atmospheric temperature, humidity, and particulate count, and get a sample of this fluid, Joran ordered, his voice tight. He needed data. Data was the shield against the irrational. "Sir, with respect, the air isn't just wet, it's salty. I can taste it on the recyclers." Brecker's light panned up, revealing walls that should have been polished steel. They were not. They were filmed with the same greasy sheen as the floor, and condensation ran down them in slow, thick rivulets. The emergency lights, which should have provided a steady, low-level glow, were dead, all of them. The only sound, beyond their own breathing, was a constant, maddeningly rhythmic drip, 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 from somewhere high up in the darkness. And something else. A low-frequency hum that vibrated through the soles of his boots, a bass note felt in the bones, not the ears. It felt like the groaning of the arcology's pylons, but deeper, more resonant, more alive. Joran's carefully constructed composure began to fray. He hated this. The sensory input was a flagrant contradiction of the facility's known schematics. It was an anomaly. And his entire life, his entire purpose since the loss of his family, was dedicated to the principle that there were no true anomalies, only failures of observation and analysis. "Your suit's filters are rated for a level 4 biohazard, Brecker. You can't taste anything," Joran snapped, the word sharper than intended. "Just get the sample." "Aye, sir." There was no challenge in Brecker's voice, only weary obedience. The enforcer knelt, the servos and his suit whining softly, and uncapped a sterile collection vial. As he dipped it into the fluid, Joran swept his light across the chamber. The decontamination nozzles, designed to spray workers with sterilizing agents, were furred with a pale gray-green growth, like fungus. The control panels were dark, their touchscreens slick with moisture. This wasn't a system failure. This was a transformation. The environment itself had been overwritten. His initial resolve, the solid certainty he'd felt just minutes ago, had dissolved into a cold pool of apprehension in his gut. The chanting sickness wasn't just in the workers. It was in the walls, in the air. He felt a sudden, primal need to check his own suit's integrity, to confirm the seal on his helmet. He was breathing canned, purified air. He was safe. But the feeling of the warm, wet atmosphere seemed to press in, a psychological weight that defied physical barriers. He was inside the contaminated box, but the nature of the contamination was something he had no category for. This wasn't pathology. It felt like ecology. Brecker stood up, sealing the vial. "Sample secured, sir. What now?" Joran didn't answer immediately. His lamp beam had found the far wall and the inner airlock door that led to the refinery's main processing floor. Unlike the one they'd entered through, this one was not sealed. It was open, just a crack, maybe a hand's width, a sliver of absolute blackness in the gray steel. No, not absolute blackness. As his eyes adjusted, he saw it. From the narrow gap, a faint, sickly light spilled onto the slick floor. It wasn't the harsh, flickering white of a failing LED. It was a soft, organic luminescence, a pulse, a slow, rhythmic tide of blue-green light like a sleeping heart. It swelled for a moment, then faded. Swelled and faded. It was the light from the initial incident report, the source he'd come to find and extinguish. "Joran!" Brecker's voice was closer now, tinged with concern. Joran finally tore his gaze away from the pulsing gap. He looked at the vial in Brecker's hand, at the unnaturally placid fluid inside it. He felt the deep hum in his bones, heard the steady drip of corrupted water. He took what felt like the first real breath since entering, and the recycled air in his lungs tasted stale, thin, and utterly inadequate. "That," Joran said, his voice a near whisper, all clinical detachment gone, replaced by a raw, focused dread. "That's where we're going." "Keep your footing," Brecker murmured, his voice a low rumble. The beam from his pulse carbine cut a sharp, white cone through the soupy gloom. "Floor's slicker than a dry feet's promise." Joran didn't reply. His attention was fixed on the data pad in his gloved hands, its integrated lamp adding a second, less steady beam that danced across the walls. The corridor, a familiar artery of reclaimed steel and pre-cascade concrete, was no longer just a corridor. It was a symptom. "Thermal is elevated by 3.2 degrees, Joran stated, his voice a clicked professional monotone he used to build walls around his own unease. "Airborne particulate count is anomalous." "Anomalous," Brecker repeated, the word flat and unimpressed. "Rust rot, Joran. Look." He stopped, his carbine's beam fixed on the wall to their left. Joran followed the light, and his methodical analysis stuttered to a halt. The steel plating, pockmarked with rust and 70 years of damp, was no longer flat. It bulged outwards as if under pressure from within. From the seams between the panels and from hairline fractures in the metal itself, a lattice of crystalline growth had erupted. It wasn't random, like frost or mineral deposits. It was structured, branching in intricate fractal patterns that echoed both the circuits of a microprocessor and the architecture of a Gorgonian fan coral. It glowed. A sickly, beautiful light pulsed from within the structures, a palette of deep-sea blues and greens that cast their two shadows long and distorted down the corridor. The light wasn't steady. It ebbed and flowed with a slow, rhythmic cadence, like a slumbering lung. Scientific awe, cold and sharp, pierced through Joran's apprehension. This was more than mass hysteria. This was a physical manifestation, tangible data. "Fascinating," he breathed, stepping closer. His datapad whirred, its sensors drinking in the spectral data. "This isn't a fungus. The energy signature is all wrong. No chlorophyll, no signs of fungal mycotoxins. It's silicious, almost, like it's extruding the raw materials from the metal itself. He saw it then. Tiny shimmering veins, no thicker than a human hair, spiderwebbed from the base of the coral-like growths, sinking into the corroded steel. The structure wasn't growing on the wall, it was growing out of it. They moved deeper, the silence broken only by the drip, drip, drip of condensation from overhead pipes and the soft crunch of their boots on a thin, gritty layer of something that coated the floor. The growths became more prevalent, constricting the corridor. Thick, pulsing stalks had fused with the bundles of fiber-optic cables that hung like metal vines, the sickly bioluminescence now running along the cables themselves, turning the arteries of Haven's data network into a part of this alien biology. "It's rewriting the environment," Joran whispered, his own words chilling him more than the damp air ever could. This wasn't a contaminant, it was a conversion. They rounded a corner, and Joran stopped dead. A massive growth, a veritable reef, blocked more than half the passage. It pulsed with a brighter, more confident light, and near its center, a single arm-thick tendril of the stuff had pushed through the wall and hung in the air, dripping the same viscous fluid that coated their boots. It was close enough to touch. The need to know was a physical ache in his chest, a roaring fire that always burned away his fear. His past failure, the ghosts of the anodyne path, screamed at him that belief was the enemy. But this was not belief. This was biology. This was something he could measure, classify, and therefore defeat. "Brecker, hold your light steady, right there," Joran commanded, his voice tight. "Joran, no." Brecker's voice was a low warning. "Don't be an idiot. You don't know what that is." "That's the point," Joran shot back, already pulling off his right glove. The humid air felt shockingly warm and slick against his bare skin. He ignored Brecker's muttered curse and stepped forward until the tip of the crystalline tendril was inches from his face. It smelled of the deep ocean and hot metal. He could feel a strange low-frequency vibration emanating from it, a hum that resonated in his teeth. His clinical detachment was a fragile shield. He remembered another time, another room, the smell of chemical incense and the placid smiles of people about to die for a belief he couldn't disprove fast enough. This time, he would have proof. He would have the physical evidence. His heart hammered against his ribs. His fingers brushed the surface. The horror he expected, the slime, the burn, the immediate infection, didn't come. The texture was surprisingly firm, like rough, unpolished stone, and dry to the touch. But beneath the surface grit, there was a deep, impossible warmth. Not the heat of a chemical reaction, but the radiating, living warmth of a body. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, then pressed his palm flat against it. The response was instantaneous. The tendril didn't recoil. It didn't attack. Instead, the entire structure flared with a brilliant, silent pulse of cyan light. The pulse wasn't an explosion. It was a signal. It shot from his hand, down the tendril, and into the larger mass on the wall. From there, it raced down the corridor in both directions, a wave of light that jumped from one growth to the next, illuminating the full, horrifying extent of the biomechanical infestation. For a split second, the entire corridor was lit up as bright as an Arium sky dome, revealing a world of coral and steel, of pulsating anes wrapped around groaning pipes. A living system that had already claimed this entire section of the refinery. Joran snatched his hand back as if he'd touched a live power conduit, a strangled gasp escaping his lips. He stared at his palm, expecting to see it burned or blowing or changed. It was just his hand, pale, trembling slightly, but his own. Brecker let out a slow, shaky breath. Rust rot, he whispered, his carbine now aimed down the corridor, into the darkness where the light had faded. Joran's mind raced, desperately trying to reassemble the shattered fragments of his rational worldview. A piezoelectric reaction? Biofeedback? The words were meaningless ash. That wasn't a reaction. That was a response. It had felt him. It had announced him. The scientific awe had curdled, leaving only the cold, stark dread of true, foundational horror. He fumbled his glove back on, his fingers clumsy. He raised his datapad, the screen's sterile light a pathetic defense against the living glow that now seemed to watch them from the walls. "Log it," he said, his voice a strained croak, the clinical mask shattered. Log. Tactile contact resulted in a chain reaction luminescent event. As the words left his mouth, a new sound echoed from the darkness ahead. It was soft, rhythmic, a wet, organic clicking, like coral striking steel, over and over.
The metal deck plating hummed with a new and insistent frequency, a deep thrum that vibrated up through the soles of Joran's boots and into his teeth. The familiar rhythmic groans of Haven's stressed pylons were a distant percussion, drowned out by this closer, more harmonic drone. The air, usually thick with the metallic tang of recycled air and ozone, now carried a strange organic sweetness, like blooming algae and wet soil, but with an undercurrent of something electric, something charged. "Energy readings are spiking," Joran murmured, his eyes fixed on the flickering screen of his datapad. He didn't need the device to tell him that. A pulsing blue-green light was bleeding from around the next junction, painting the perpetually slick corridor walls in shifting, aqueous patterns. "Whatever's happening, the Nexus is up ahead." "Keep your footing," Brecker said, his voice a low rumble beside Joran. The corporate enforcer moved with a heavy, deliberate grace, his weapon held at a low ready. His presence was a solid wall of muscle and grim purpose in the narrow passage. "Smells like lung-rot in bloom." Joran didn't answer. His focus was entirely on the light, on the sound. He'd spent his life analyzing the pathologies of belief, tracing them back to environmental stressors. Signal bleed psychosis, neurotoxins. Metal hum madness was a known quality, a precursor. But this felt different. It felt coherent, organized. They reached the threshold of the main protein vat nexus. It wasn't a door, but a vast arched opening into a cavernous chamber. For a moment, all Joran could do was stare, his meticulously ordered world grinding to a halt. The nexus was a cathedral of light. The central processing vat, a colossal cylinder of reclaimed steel that should have been sterile and gray, was the source. But it was no longer just metal. A lattice of something living, something like bone-white coral and pulsing venous tissue had overgrown its surface. It climbed the vat in intricate spiraling patterns, glowing from within with a soft, hypnotic bioluminescence. The light was not the sickly green of decay fungus, but a profound oceanic blue, shifting in time with the deep, resonant hum that filled the chamber. It was, against all reason, beautiful. "By the deep brine," Brecker breathed, his professional hardness cracking. He took a half-step back.
Joran's first thought was purely academic. An unknown extremophilic symbiotic organism, fungal perhaps, triggered by a chemical leak from the vats. The energy readings are a byproduct of its metabolic process. He raised his datapad, his fingers moving automatically, initiating a full-spectrum analysis. He needed data. He needed to classify it, name it, reduce it to a sterile set of facts. That was how you defeated a god. You dissected it. Then he saw the faces. They were part of the lattice. The missing refinery workers were here, all of them. But they weren't standing before an altar. They were the altar. A woman's torso was seamlessly fused into the glowing coral, her arm outstretched, fingers elongated and merged with a thick bundle of data conduits. A man's head and shoulders emerged from the pulsating flesh near the base, his face tilted toward the vaulted ceiling, eyes closed, an expression of serene, placid ecstasy on his features. Skin, bone, and sinew had been woven into the structure, their bodies becoming living ornaments on this shrine. Electrical cables snaked into what was once a chest cavity, pulsing with the same blue light that now shone from beneath translucent skin. Nutrient paste pipes, designed to feed the arcology, were now embedded in them, their contents repurposed. Jorn's breath hitched. The datapad chimed, displaying the results of the bioscan. His mind refused to process what it was showing him. 52 life signs. That was the number of missing workers. But the pad wasn't registering 52 distinct signals. It was registering one. One single, massive, complex biological entity. Heart rate, respiration, neural activity, all synchronized. All subsumed into a single, unified system. They weren't dead. They weren't even individuals anymore. They were a single composite organism, fused with the refinery's machinery. The sweet smell in the air was them. The harmonic chant was them, a vocalization resonating from dozens of throats, no longer entirely their own. This wasn't a cognitive virus. This wasn't mass hysteria. This was apotheosis. The horror landed in Joran's gut like a block of ice. It was a cold, clean thing, shorn of all academic detachment. This was a physical transformation, a biological reality. It was an irreversible checkpoint, a truth from which he could never retreat. His life's work, his entire rational worldview, was a flimsy shield against this fact. The belief hadn't just infected their minds, it had consumed and remade their flesh. Joran, Brecker's voice was tight. What are we looking at? Tell me what it is. It's them, Joran whispered, his voice hoarse. His gaze drifted from face to face, embedded in the living architecture. He recognized one, a young man named Cale, from the personnel files. His face was barely visible, encased in a crystalline shell, but his eyes were open. Or were they? They were orbs of pure, soft light, staring into nothing. Brecker raised his pulse rifle, the targeting laser a single sharp red dot against the gentle blue glow. We need to purge it. Call in a sanitation crew. No. The word was out of Joran's mouth before he'd thought it. It was a reflex, sharp and absolute. Don't shoot. Don't do anything. They're monsters, Joran. Look at them. They're not attacking. They're singing, Joran said, the word tasting like blasphemy on his tongue. He took a hesitant step forward, ignoring Brecker's sharp intake of breath. He had to see. He had to understand. The datapad in his hand felt like a child's toy, a useless ward against an ocean of impossible truth. The chanting, the thrumming, the light, it all seemed to intensify as he drew closer. It felt like walking into a pressure wave. The air grew heavy, charged. He saw it now, the fine detail. Human veins ran parallel to copper wires. Knuckles of bone had become nodes where conduits converged. The patterns weren't random. They had a terrifying organic symmetry, like a snowflake designed by a psychotic god. He remembered the cultist in the interrogation room. "We are not the ones who sing of endings." He had thought it was a pithy, meaningless koan from a deluded mind. Now, standing before this choir of flesh and steel, Joran felt a tremor of a different kind of understanding. This wasn't an end, it was a grotesque and terrifying beginning. His clinical detachment, the armor he had worn since his family's death, had been shattered. In its place was a raw, primal fear he hadn't felt in years, the fear of being fundamentally, catastrophically wrong. He stared into the serene, inhuman faces of the chorus, and for the first time he felt the terrifying possibility that he was not the doctor diagnosing a disease. He was the fool shouting at the tide. The air was the first violation. It wasn't just the familiar arcology cocktail of ozone, wet rust, and recycled breath. Here, in the main protein vat nexus of the refinery, a new scent had usurped all others. The cloying sweetness of cooked sugar layered over the coppery tang of blood, mingling with the low-tide brine of the city's deepest sumps. It was the smell of a feast and a morgue, and it clung to the back of Joran's throat. He stood frozen on the grated catwalk, his hand resting on the corroded safety rail, the metal slick and strangely warm beneath his glove. Below him, where the nexus of colossal nutrient vats should have been a sterile, orderly forest of polished steel, something else had grown. It was a shrine, a throne, a tumor. Pale, veined flesh, the color of drowned skin, had swallowed the central vat entirely. It cascaded down its sides in thick, fleshy waves, engulfing pipes and support struts, merging them into its own impossible biology. Filaments of sickly blue-green light pulsed within it, a slow, rhythmic tide of bioluminescence that matched a deep, resonant hum vibrating through the deck plates. It was the same hum he'd heard on the recordings, the chant from the quarantined workers, but now it had a physical weight, a presence that pressed in on him. Embedded in the mass, like fossils in amber, were the workers. Dozens of them. Their bodies were not merely trapped, but integrated, their limbs flowing seamlessly into the biomechanical structure. Faces emerged from the pulsating surface, features blurred and indistinct, their expressions not of pain, but of a terrifying, ecstatic serenity. Their mouths were slightly open, as if they were the source of the unending hum. The entire structure was breathing. This is not pathology, Joran thought. A wave of cognitive vertigo washing over him. The floor seemed to tilt. This is not a symptom. It is Genesis. His mind, a fortress built of rationalism and diagnostic manuals, was being systematically dismantled by the sight before him. Signal bleed psychosis didn't do this. Neurotoxins didn't orchestrate creation. The dead cultist in the interrogation room, the one who had crystallized into a glowing coral statue, had been a prelude. This was the symphony. Rust rot, Brecker breathed beside him, the curse a ragged whisper against the overwhelming hum. His heavy kinetic pistol was already in his hand, the polymer grip stark against his scarred knuckles. He wasn't looking at the shrine with existential horror, but with the tactical appraisal of a man facing a predator. "Is it hostile?" Joran couldn't answer. Hostile? The word felt laughably inadequate. It was like asking if a tidal wave was hostile. It simply was. "I don't know," he finally managed, his own voice sounding thin and distant. He forced his gaze away from the serene, lost faces in the flesh pulp, tracing the glowing veins that snaked across the machinery. They pulsed in time with the faint green glow of the emergency LEDs, creating a nauseating strobe effect in the deep shadows of the cavernous chamber. Condensation dripped from the ceiling high above, each drop hitting the metal with a sharp tick, a frantic counter-rhythm to the shrine's deep, slow heartbeat. The directorate's cover story? A neurotoxin leak? Joran muttered, more to himself than to Brecker. He let out a dry, humorless sound that was almost a laugh. "They'll need a better live for this." The scale of it, the sheer biological impossibility, was an insult to every principle he had ever held. His work was about deconstruction, about peeling back the layers of belief to find the rotten, pathological core. But this was an act of construction. A new and terrible form of life was being born from the despair of the bellows. Brecker took a half-step forward, his weapon held low. "Whatever it is, we're not reporting it until we know what we're dealing with. Otho will just purge the whole level. My people are still down here."
Joran's own past failures surged up, the memory of another flock, another fire, his family. The guilt was a physical thing, a cold weight in his stomach. He had failed to stop that fate, and it had consumed them. Now a new fate was building its own temple of flesh and steel, and he was once again standing by, watching. "Joran." Brecker's voice was sharp, cutting through the hum. "Look, by the main conduit, we're not alone." Joran's head snapped up. He followed Brecker's gaze across the chasm of the Nexus. For a moment he saw nothing but the labyrinth of pipes and shadows. Then a piece of the darkness detached itself. A figure. It was standing on a lower gantry, partially obscured by a column thick with rust and fungal growth. The figure was cloaked in the ragged, layered attire of an ungrounded, the kind of scavenger you'd expect to find picking through the industrial guts of the arcology. But this person wasn't scavenging. They were perfectly still, a silent observer in the echoing dark. Joran's heart hammered against his ribs. A chorus member. It had to be. Brecker raised his pistol slightly, the motion fluid and economical. Target acquired. "Do I engage?" "No." "Wait," Joran commanded, his voice a strained whisper. He raised his optical scanner, the lens whirring softly as he zoomed in. The image resolved on his wrist-mounted display, grainy in the low light. The figure was tall, lean, their face hidden in the deep shadow of a hood. They weren't looking around for patrols or searching for scrap. Their entire posture, their absolute stillness, was focused on the pulsating shrine. As Joran watched, the figure slowly lifted a hand, not in a gesture of command or triumph, but in one of profound, aching sorrow. The hand, thin and pale, reached out towards the biomechanical mass, stopping just short of touching the air that shimmered around it. The gesture was that of a man reaching for a dying loved one, desperate to offer comfort, but knowing it was futile. There was no malice in the stance, no fanaticism, only a deep, terrible reverence. A grief so palpable, Joran could feel it across the chamber. This was Kalis Render. He knew it with a certainty that defied logic.
the patient zero, the architect of the plague, the man who had orchestrated this abomination, and he was mourning it.
Every theory Joran had built, every clinical diagnosis and strategic assumption crumbled into dust. The man he had come to hunt, the monster he envisioned, wasn't cackling over his work. He was standing like a shepherd who had lost his entire flock to a beautiful, terrifying disease he could no longer control. He was not the cause of the disharmonious song. He was its first, and perhaps most heartbroken listener. Brecker shifted his weight, the grated floor groaning in protest. Orders, Joran? He's the leader, right? This is our chance." Joran stared at the sorrowful silhouette, at the pulsating monument of transformed humanity, and at the gaping void where his certainty used to be. The mission was to find the source and neutralize it. But the man across the chasm didn't look like a source. He looked like a consequence. "Hold your position," Joran whispered, his mind racing. "He hasn't seen us. I need to understand what I'm looking at." The air was a thick, hot soup of ozone and fungal damp. Every breath Joran dragged into his burning lungs felt like swallowing a wet rag. His polished directorate boots, so practical in the sterile corridors of the Arium, were a liability here, slipping on the perpetually slick metal grating of the catwalk. Ahead, a shadow detached itself from other shadows, a fleeting silhouette against the sickly green glow of a failing junction light. Kalis Rendor. "He's not slowing," Joran gasped, his voice a raw tear in his throat. He clutched a rusted railing, knuckles white, the cold, pitted metal a shocking contrast to his overheated skin. Each thud of his heart was a hammer blow against his ribs. Brecker didn't seem to be breathing hard at all. The big enforcer moved with a predatory economy Joran could only envy. His heavy-soled boots finding purchase where Joran found only slickness. He glanced back, his face half-lit by the emergency lighting, his expression unreadable but for the focus in his eyes. "He's running on faith. We're running on kilocals. We'll win." It wasn't reassuring. Kalis scrambled over a collapsed section of walkway with the agility of an ungrounded scavenger, disappearing into a maw of tangled pipes and conduit that plunged deeper into the bellow's forgotten anatomy. Rust rot. The official schematics of these levels were a century out of date, a polite fiction. Down here was a maze carved by desperation and decay.
"We've lost him," Joran spat, more in frustration at his own failing body than at Brecker. His clinical detachment, his most prized tool, had been scoured away by the raw physicality of the chase. All that was left was the screaming, primal need to corner his specimen. "No." Brecker's voice was low and certain. He placed a hand on a massive, sweating pipe, his fingers splayed as if reading a pulse in the groaning metal. The distant rhythmic hum of Haven's machinery was stronger here, a tangible vibration that seeped into bone. "He's running scared, not smart. He'll stick to the main service lines." He pointed toward the dark opening Kalis had vanished into. "That's a primary coolant conduit. Feeds into the old reclamation stack at Grid Epsilon. He thinks it's an escape route." Joran wiped condensation from his face, his sleeve coming away smeared with rust. "And it's not." A rare grim smile touched Brecker's lips. "The pre-cascade blueprints show a straight shot. The directorate maps repeat the lie. My grandfather worked reclamation. That junction collapsed 60 years ago. It's a dead end." The smile vanished. A loop. It spits you out 3 levels down, right back into this sector. He's running in a circle. Joran processed the information, his analytical mind latching on to the data like a drowning man to a life raft. A predictable pattern, a flaw in the system. Hope, cold and sharp, cut through his exhaustion. "So we just wait for him to emerge?" "We don't wait. Brecker tapped a narrow, vertical maintenance shaft Joran hadn't even registered, its entrance barely wider than a man's shoulders and choked with hanging wires like metallic vines. This is a pressure equalization duct. It intersects the coolant conduit at the next junction. It's tight, but it's direct. I can cut him off. Brecker looked at Joran, his gaze assessing. You keep following the main path. Make noise. Let him think you're right behind him. He'll run right to me. Joran nodded, his breath still coming in ragged bursts. Understood. Without another word, Brecker squeezed into the shaft and was swallowed by the darkness. Joran was alone. The scale of the bellows pressed in on him. The groaning of stressed metal pylons sounded like the moans of a dying leviathan. The air tasted of wet copper and rot. For a moment his own past failure echoed in the oppressive dark. The sterile room, the scent of bitter almonds, the unbearable silence after the chanting stopped. He shook his head, physically dislodging the memory. This was not the Aethelgard collective. This would not be another failure. He forced his legs to move, his steps now deliberate, loud on the grating. He banged his hand against a pipe as he passed. "Nowhere to run, Rendor," he shouted, his voice sounding thin and desperate in the cavernous space. He just needed to be the predator. The relentless, rational force of order hunting the pathological belief. He entered the maw of the conduit. The world shrank to the narrow beam of his headlamp. The cylindrical tunnel was slick with a thin layer of gray-green algae. Pipes of varying diameters lined the walls and ceiling, some weeping a dark, viscous fluid that smelled of brine and decay. The air was thick, movement sluggish. It was like wading through warm, spoiled water. He could hear scrambling up ahead, the scrape of a boot, a dislodged piece of rust clattering down the curved floor. Kaelis was still there. Brecker's plan was working. Joran pushed himself faster, ignoring the stitch in his side. The conduit began to curve, and a new light source became visible. It wasn't the harsh, flickering LED of Haven's infrastructure. It was a soft, biological pulse, blue and green, with veins of sickly violet. It coated the right-hand wall of the tunnel, a living carpet of fungal matter that seemed to breathe. The light waxed and waned in time with the deep hum of the arcology, as if the city's machinery was its heart. The sight was monstrously beautiful. It was the plague made manifest, the sickness given form, and it was spreading through the very veins of his city. He was so fixated on the pulsing wall that he almost missed the change in acoustics. The scrambling sound from up ahead had stopped. In its place, from a junction just beyond the curve, came a sudden sharp grunt and the wet, heavy thud of two bodies colliding. A choked cry, the scrape of fabric against rusted metal. Joran broke into a clumsy, slipping run, his heart hammering with a mix of dread and vindication. He rounded the bend, and the scene resolved itself in the pulsing, otherworldly glow. Brecker had him. He had timed it perfectly, emerging from a side duct concealed by a curtain of black cables. Kaelis was slammed against the wall of living fungus. Brecker's augmented forearm pressed hard across his throat. The enforcer's body was a solid wall of muscle and grim purpose, pinning the slighter man with contemptuous ease. Kaelis's hand scrabbled uselessly at Brecker's arm, his feet kicking for purchase on the slick floor. The fungal mass reacted to the impact. The section directly behind Kaelis flared with a brilliant, intense azure light, illuminating the two figures in stark, horrifying detail. The pulsing quickened, the colors swirling around Kaelis's head like a diseased halo. The matter seemed to be reaching for him. tiny phosphorescent filaments, like mycelial threads, lifted from the surface and swayed in the still air, drawn to the warmth and panic of their captive. Joran skidded to a halt a few meters away, panting, his headlamp beam dancing over the scene. He saw Kalis's face for the first time up close. He wasn't the wild-eyed fanatic Joran had expected. His eyes, wide with the shock of the capture, were lucid, terrifyingly calm even as he was being choked. They weren't the eyes of a madman. They were the eyes of a shepherd who had just watched a wolf break into his fold. "Got him," Brecker grunted, the words tight with effort. He pressed harder, cutting off Kalis's air. Patient zero. Secured. Joran stared, his exhaustion forgotten, replaced by a cold, thrilling sense of triumph that was immediately soured by the pulsing, living light. He had his specimen, the source of the mimetic virus, the man who held the key to dismantling this faith. But as he looked at Kalis Render pinned against that breathing wall of alien life, a sliver of his core fear broke through the surface. The terrible thought that he hadn't just captured a man. He had captured a part of the song. The slap of Joran's boots on the graded catwalk echoed his own ragged breathing. He rounded the last junction, his side stitching with a hot, sharp pain. The air here was a thick, cloying cocktail of ozone and something acrid like burnt sugar. Flashing emergency strobes from the main refinery floor cast long, dancing shadows down the maintenance corridor, turning the constant drip of condensation from overhead pipes into a staccato of dark, falling teardrops. Then he saw them. At the nexus of three converging catwalks, Brecker Hune stood like a monolith carved from salvaged steel. His augmented arm, usually gleaming, was slick with grime and moisture. He wasn't looking at Joran. His attention was fixed on the figure at his feet. Joran slowed to a stop, one hand on the rusted guardrail to steady himself, his lungs burning. The adrenal spike from the raid was beginning to curdle into something else: confusion. The sounds of the struggle, the shouts, the discharge of sonic suppressors, the clang of metal on metal were fading, replaced by the deep, resonant groanings of the arcology's bones. Brecker finally looked up, his face an impassive mask under the flickering white LEDs. "Sir, situation contained." Joran's eyes were locked on the prisoner. The man was on his knees, wrists bound behind his back with a polymer flex cuff. He hadn't been thrown down or forced. He knelt as if in prayer, his posture utterly relaxed, limp. He was young, maybe 25, with a thin frame that seemed lost inside the standard-issue damp skin overalls. His head was bowed, dark hair plastered to his scalp with sweat and the ever-present humidity. He was not resisting. He wasn't even tense. "Report," Joran said. His voice was a harsh rasp. He forced himself to walk forward, his professional persona a suit of armor he donned over his fraying nerves. His datapad felt heavy in his hand, its screen glowing with triage metrics and casualty reports from the disastrous raid. "The squad cornered him here," Brecker said, his tone flat, factual. "He was just standing, watching the others fight. When they were all down or fled, I approached. He made no move." Brecker nudged the prisoner's shoulder with the toe of his reinforced boot. The man swayed slightly, but didn't otherwise react. I told him to get on his knees. He did. Gave me his hands. No resistance. None at all.
Pathology. Tactical passivity, Joran's mind supplied instantly. A trained response to de-escalate and feign compliance. A way to get inside, to become the serpent in the sterile room. He had seen it before. Zealots trained to exploit the system's procedures. But this felt different. The others, the ones who had fought with makeshift clubs and wrenches, had been frenzied, their eyes wide with a manic terror. This man was quiet, an island of stillness in the chaos he had supposedly helped orchestrate. Is he drugged? Joran crouched, keeping a safe distance. He ran his gaze over the man, cataloging, dissecting. The skin of his neck and hands held a faint, almost imperceptible pattern, like watermarks on old paper. Under the harsh flicker of the LEDs, they seemed to shimmer with a hint of sickly green. Bioluminescence. Stage 2 or 3 of the mimetic infection, consistent with the other chanters. Biometrics are clear, no recognized narcotics in his system. Heart rate is slow, abnormally so. 60 beats per minute, Brecker reported. Calmer than mine. Joran felt a muscle twitch in his jaw. Calmer than a corporate enforcer in the aftermath of a riot. Impossible. It was an act. It had to be. He was the leader. Patient zero. Careless Rendor. He had to be. Get him on his feet, Joran ordered, standing up. I want to see his eyes. Brecker hooked his fingers under the prisoner's arm and hauled him up. The man offered no help, his body a dead weight, but he didn't resist either. He rose fluidly, a marionette with its strings pulled, and then his head lifted. Joran's breath caught in his throat. It wasn't the face of a fanatic. There was no wild gleam, no righteous fury, no vacant stare of a mind lost to delusion. The man's eyes were clear, a pale washed-out gray, and they were fixed on Joran. Not with fear, not with hatred, with pity. It was the look a medic might give a terminally ill patient, a profound, soul-deep sorrow that was galaxies away from condescension. It was a look of genuine empathy, and it was directed at him, the forensic theologian, the doctor of broken beliefs, the man in control. Joran felt a cold spike of pure, unadulterated anger drive through the floor of his professionalism. The memory of another cult, another set of serene, pitying eyes flashed behind his own. The smell of ozone and chemical accelerants. The failure. His failure. "What's your designation?" Joran snapped, his voice louder than intended, echoing in the damp space. "Who sent you? Who is Cadus Rendor?" The prisoner's expression didn't change. He simply blinked, a slow, deliberate motion. The faint patterns on his skin pulsed once, a soft wave of viridian light that matched the rhythm of the groaning metal pylons far below. A low hum vibrated through the grating under Joran's feet, a chord that seemed to resonate deep in his bones. The prisoner's lips parted. His voice, when it came, was not the cracked yell of a zealot, but a soft, calm baritone. It was like a clear note played in a room full of static. "You don't understand," he said, the words falling into the space between the drips of water. "You don't understand what you've done." There was no threat in the statement, no malice. It was a diagnosis, a pronouncement of a terrible, irreversible mistake. He spoke as if Joran were a child who had just knocked over a critical piece of machinery, oblivious to the catastrophic chain reaction he had set in motion. For a moment, Joran was speechless. All his protocols, all his diagnostic trees and deconstructionist rhetoric fell away. He was not an examiner observing a specimen.
He was a man being judged by his own subject. The air felt heavy, charged. The rhythmic groan of the orcology seemed to deepen, to take on a mournful, guttural quality. Brecker, immune to the psychological warfare, broke the spell. "He's secure, sir. Mobile command is prepped for transport and interrogation." Joran tore his eyes away from the prisoners, forcing himself to look at Brecker. He nodded, his movements stiff. The adrenaline was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp-edged determination. This calm, this infuriating, impossible calm, it wasn't a symptom. It was a shield, and he would break it. "Take him," Joran said, his voice a low growl. "I'll handle him personally." As Brecker moved to escort the prisoner, the man's pitying gaze remained fixed on Joran. It followed him as he turned away, a weight on his back heavier than any physical burden. The prisoner's words echoed with the groaning metal, a disharmonious song that promised a deeper, more terrible truth than Joran had ever been prepared to face.
The air in the secure storage room was thick enough to chew. It tasted of ozone, rust, and the low-tide stench of the bellows clinging to everything like a second skin. A single, ruthless LED strip on the ceiling painted the scene in harsh white and deep, dancing shadows. Condensation wept down the corrugated metal walls, each droplet tracing a slow path through grime and decay. Drip, drip, drip. The sound was a maddeningly patient metronome counting down to nothing. Joran Vask circled his quarry. The scuff of his mag boots on the grated floor was the only aggressive sound in the room. It was the sound of a predator pacing, a sound of control. He felt a savage, triumphant fire in his gut. After the chaos in the refinery, the shrieking and the seizures, this was order. This was progress. Here in this cage of wet steel was the source, patient zero. Kneeling in the center of the room was the man who called himself Kalis. He wasn't bound. There was no need. Brecker stood guard outside the reinforced hatch, a mountain of corporate muscle and alloy. Kalis knelt with his back straight, hands resting on his thighs, a picture of infuriating serenity. His face, under the unforgiving glare of the LED, was a placid mask. Joran couldn't find a single micro-expression of fear, no telltale flicker of the eye. It was like interrogating a statue carved from moon kelp. "Let's start again," Joran said, his voice a low growl that barely carried over the hum of a distant water purifier. He stopped behind Kalis, looming over him. "I'm not a directorate thumper, Kalis. I don't use bone breakers and stim jabs. I am a doctor, and you are the disease. But every disease has a pathology, a transmission vector, a point of origin." Joran resumed his circling, his words sharp and precise, each one a scalpel seeking a weak point. The chanting sickness, a mimetic contagion with a recursive linguistic payload. It overwrites baseline cognitive function with a parasitic loop of vocalizations. It's elegant, I'll give you that. Brutally so. But it's artificial. It was design.
He leaned in close, his breath fogging slightly in the chilled air. "So, tell me, what's the carrier signal? Is it audio-based? A subharmonic frequency layered into the metal hum? Is it airborne? A psychotropic spore released into the ventilation? Or is it something more esoteric? A visual glyph? A pattern hidden in the flickering lights?" Kalis remained silent. His gaze was fixed on a point on the far wall, where a trail of dark rust bled into a patch of sickly green fungus. His breathing was slow, even, deep. Joran's jaw tightened. The triumphant fire began to curdle into something sour, frustration. I have 27 workers from the protein refinery in quarantine, catatonic. They're carving sigils into their own skin with their fingernails. They speak, but not with their own voices. They speak with yours. He tapped a finger against his temple. This is a weapon, and every weapon has a safety, a countermeasure, a deactivation code. Give it to me. Finally, Kalis stirred. He tilted his head, not to look at Joran, but as if listening to something far away. When he spoke, his voice was unnervingly calm, a quiet pool in the roaring chaos of the arcology. You hear the noise, but not the music. Joran stopped dead. What? The song is not a weapon, Kalis continued, his eyes still distant. It is a lullaby, a very old one. But you, your machines, your suppressors, your panic, you are screaming into the cradle. It is a disharmonious sound. Joran let out a short, sharp laugh, devoid of humor. A lullaby, of course. And the men tearing at their own flesh, I suppose they're just having a nightmare? He strode to face Kalis, planting his feet and crossing his arms. The mask of the clinical academic was beginning to slip, revealing the raw anger beneath. Don't insult my intelligence with nursery rhymes and mystic rust rot. I have analyzed over 300 emergent belief systems. I have dismantled God constructs from the Arium data sects to the sump scrapers in the deep docks. You are not unique. You are a textbook case of messianic narcissism leveraging environmental psychosis. You are a doctor who only studies the scream, not the reason for the pain, Kalis replied, his voice still a maddeningly gentle murmur. He finally lifted his eyes to meet Joran's. There was no defiance in them. There was pity. A deep, profound pity that enraged Joran more than any threat could. You are so loud, Joran Vask, so out of tune. You think you are bringing silence, but you are just adding to the noise. You make the dreamer stir. The dreamer, Joran spat the word, the memory of another cult, another leader who spoke of dreams and ascensions, flashed behind his eyes. The smell of chemical fires and the cold finality of failure. His fists clenched, the knuckles white. He could feel the tremor in his own hands. Stop it! Joran's voice was lower now, shaking with a fury he could no longer contain. Just stop it! Stop the metaphors. Stop the condescending, tranquil act. You're a doomsday cultist. You promise transcendence in a world of decay because it sells. You prey on the hopeless, the dampskins choking on nutrient paste and despair, and you offer them a glorious oblivion. He was shouting now, his voice echoing off the sweating metal. He was no longer a forensic theologian. He was a man screaming at a ghost, at a past he couldn't outrun. The drip, drip, drip was lost in the roaring of blood in his ears. You talk of songs and lullabies, but you want an ending. You want to see this whole rust bucket arcology slide into the brine, don't you? You want to drag everyone down into the dark with you, into the stillness. His chest was heaving. The cool, detached professional was gone, burned away by a grief he kept locked in a cage deep inside him. He stood there, panting, exposed. Kalis watched him. The faint coral-like patterns on his neck pulsed with a soft internal blue light, a rhythm that did not match Joran's frantic heartbeat. He took a slow, deliberate breath, and the silence that followed Joran's tirade was deafening. Then he spoke. The words were simple, clear, and they struck Joran with the force of a physical blow, shattering his rage into a million pieces of ice-cold confusion. We are not the ones who sing of endings. The single word hung in the sterile air of the interrogation room, a perfect crystal of sound in the sudden, profound silence. You. It hadn't been shouted. It hadn't been a whisper. It had simply arrived. A calm, resonant baritone that seemed to emanate not from a point in space, but from the very structure of the man-turned statue before him. Joran stood frozen, his own breath a ragged, unwelcome noise. The tremor had subsided, leaving behind only the low electronic hum of the room's life support and the faint, almost inaudible crackle of the newly formed coral. His mind, a precision instrument honed for deconstruction, went into overdrive. Acoustic projection, a micro-emitter implanted in his larynx, triggered by the tremor's frequency. A sophisticated psyop. The hypotheses flared and died in an instant, each one more ludicrous than the last. The young man's body hadn't just stiffened, it had transfigured. The flesh had hardened and shifted, its geometry now a lattice of crystalline blue-green that pulsed with a soft, internal light. It was no longer a human body. It was a grotesque, beautiful monument to an impossibility. A speaker couldn't do this. No known technology could. The statue glowed, casting long, dancing shadows on the sterile white polymer walls. The scent in the room had changed. The sterile tang of recycled air and ozone was now undercut by a deep mineral brine, like a cold seafloor exposed to the air for the first time in a millennium. Joran took a half-step back, the magnetic soles of his boots making a soft, peeling sound on the deck. His heart hammered a frantic, terrified rhythm against his ribs. This was wrong. This defied every chapter of every text he had ever studied, every pathogen he had ever classified. Faith was a disease of the mind. It didn't rewrite physics. Then the voice came again, clear as a broadcast signal in a vacuum. It was a voice steeped in a sorrow so deep it felt geological. Your quarantine, it said, the syllables perfectly formed, resonating from the glowing coral. Your logic was a discordant note in the melody. The dreamer, the same term the cultists had used. Joran's mind raced, trying to stitch the fragments together. The metal hum madness of the bellows, the collective chanting, the hive consciousness he'd witnessed in the refinery. He had classified it as a symptom, a vector of infection. He had systematically dismantled it. Sonic suppressors, psychological isolation, breaking the subjects one by one from the herd. He had called it treatment. You are a death cult, Joran spat, the words a shield against the encroaching dread. He gestured wildly at the crystalline figure. You prey on the desperate. You offer them oblivion and call it transcendence. His own history, the ghosts of another cult, another failure, bled into his voice, making it raw. I've seen this before. Have you? The voice was tinged with something that sounded, impossibly, like pity. Did you see them sing the deep water into stillness? Did you see them quiet the groaning metal? We are not the sickness, Jordan Vask. We are the harmony. We live with the great presence, not in service to it. We keep the balance. Joran felt a cold sweat prickle the back of his neck. The name. It knew his name. Of course it did. The cultists knew his name. But hearing it spoken by this disembodied, resonant voice made his skin crawl. And your quarantine, the voice went on, its sorrow deepening, your sterile rooms and sonic dampeners. You did not isolate a disease. You built a torture chamber. You took 100 voices singing in unison, and you amplified every trace of fear, every flicker of pain. You silenced the music and left only the screaming. A memory surfaced, unbidden. The face of the young cultist, just an hour ago, the serene smile. You are out of tune. It hadn't been a metaphor. It had been a diagnosis. Lies, Joran whispered, more to himself than to the statue. Rhetoric, pathological justifications. Look at what you have wrought, the voice commanded, and though it did not raise in volume, its intensity was immense. You wanted to prove faith was a cancer, so you agitated it, you injected it with dissonance. You took our lullaby and you turned it into a disharmonious song of pain.
The blue-green light from the statue flared, momentarily blinding Joran. Images flooded his mind, unbidden. The reports from the med teams, the quarantined workers. He had thought the bioluminescent growths, the coral-like patterns erupting on their skin, were the second stage of the infection, a natural progression of the pathogen. "What you see out there now," the voice from the crystal stated. Each word, a perfectly polished stone dropped into the well of Joran's soul. "The growths, the contortions, that is not the dreamer's voice anymore. That is their agony made flesh. That is their silent scream given form." The voice paused, letting the weight of the accusation settle in the cold, silent room. "You did this." And there it was. Not just an accusation, but a verdict. The floor seemed to drop away beneath Joran's feet. A chasm of horrified doubt opened within him. The memory of his family, the fire, the promises he had made to himself over their ashes, that he would master this human flaw, that he would dissect belief until it was nothing but a series of controllable impulses, that he would never ever fail like that again. What if this Kalis Rendor, this voice in the crystal, was right? What if, in his desperate, arrogant crusade for a rational explanation, he hadn't been containing a plague, but creating one? What if he hadn't been preventing a disaster, but authoring a far more monstrous one? The thought was a physical blow. He felt his breath catch, his carefully constructed reality cracking like stressed polymer glass. No. No. He suppressed the doubt with the sheer force of his will. It was a trick, all of it, a sophisticated, layered psychological attack designed to break him. He was Joran Vask. He was an agent of the Directorate. He dealt in facts, in data, in observable phenomena. And this was an anomaly to be catalogued, not a truth to be accepted. His hand trembled as he unslung his data pad. The screen flickered to life, its cold LED light a comfort in the organic glow of the room. His fingers flew across the surface, pulling up a bioscanner interface. He had to quantify this, to measure it, to reduce it to wavelengths and energy signatures, to force it back into the box of the known world. He pointed the scanner at the silent, glowing form. The datapad whirred, its sensors struggling to interpret the impossible data. Error. Biological signature unclassifiable.
Error. Material composition unknown. Error. Energy output mimics neural activity at a macro scale. Joran stared at the scrolling errors, his knuckles white where he gripped the pad. The voice did not speak again. It didn't need to. The accusation lingered in the air, a poison he could already feel spreading through his veins. He had wanted to find the source of the disease. He was starting to fear he had found it in his own reflection on the datapad's dark screen. The silence that followed the word was heavier than the metal groaning in Haven's bones. It was a dense, weighted quiet, pressing in on Joran from all sides. The single, resonant syllable, you, seemed to have physically displaced the air in the sterile storage room. It hadn't been a shout, but its clarity had scoured his mind raw. It was still there. An echo burned into his auditory nerve, a calm, male baritone that had no business coming from the crystalline horror before him. The thing that was once a man had ceased its transformation. It stood in the center of the room, a statue of frozen, incandescent chaos. Where flesh and bone had been, there was now a latticework of mineral deposits, shimmering with the same sickly blue-green light that pulsed from its skin, now brighter, purer. It resembled a coral reef grown in the shape of a man, each branch and polyp glowing with an internal, living fire. The face was an unreadable sculpture of intersecting planes, the mouth a frozen, silent O from which that impossible word had been born. Joran's breath hitched. His professional detachment, the armor he had spent a decade forging, cracked. For a full 3 seconds, his mind was a whiteout of pure existential terror. The floor felt unstable beneath his boots, not from any tremor, but from the sudden vertiginous sensation that the fundamental laws of his reality had been repealed without notice. The constant drip of condensation from a nearby conduit sounded like a hammer striking an anvil, each drop a punctuation mark in a sentence he couldn't comprehend. Physics doesn't allow this. Biology doesn't allow this. Vocal cords made of crystal do not speak. He took a staggering step back, his hand flying to the cold, wet steel of the wall for support. The slick surface was a grounding sensation, a point of tangible reality in a room that had become a waking nightmare. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. He stared at the glowing effigy, and the pitying smile of the young cultist flashed in his memory. We are not the ones who sing of endings. And then the voice. You. An accusation. A judgment. His mind, a precision instrument trained to dissect faith into its component parts of trauma, desperation, and pathology, was failing. It sputtered, cycling through every rational diagnostic category. Auditory hallucination, induced by extreme stress and signal bleed. Possible, but the clarity was too high, the resonance too perfect. A pre-recorded sound emitter implanted in the subject, triggered by a biometric signal. More plausible, a sophisticated piece of mimetic warfare, designed by a master manipulator. But the transformation, the rapid, impossible crystallization of human tissue, no. No. Joran pushed himself off the wall, his spine straightening. The initial shockwave of fear was receding, and in its place something harder and colder began to precipitate. It was the familiar, comforting chill of intellectual fury. His mind, rejected by one path, frantically carved another. It seized on the word, the accusation, and twisted it. You. Of course. It wasn't a god judging him. It wasn't a supernatural entity breaking the laws of nature to deliver a cryptic message. It was a man named Kalis Rendor. A man so arrogant, so convinced of his own power that he had engineered this entire spectacle as a taunt. He began to pace, his steps short and sharp on the grated floor. The ozone smell from the flickering light panel was sharp in his nostrils, the scent of malfunctioning logic. He saw it now, a new schematic snapping into place in his mind, clean and rational and blessedly free of the divine. Kalis Rendor didn't discover a dormant god. He designed a mimetic virus. The chanting sickness was a weapon, an elegant piece of psychological code designed to propagate through the desperate minds of the bellows. It had parameters, rules, a harmonious song, the cultist had said, a specific frequency, a certain pattern of belief it needed to thrive. And then Joran had arrived. A disruptive element, a disharmonious song. His sonic suppressors, his sterile interrogation rooms, his systematic dismantling of their rituals. He hadn't been fighting the plague, he had been corrupting its code. He had introduced an unforeseen variable, and the program had glitched. This crystallization, this was a bug in the system, a fatal error, a mutation Kalis hadn't planned for. The plague had gone feral, and the puppet master was blaming the man who cut the strings. The voice wasn't an echo from the deep brine. It was a broadcast, a message sent through a dying biological terminal. Kalis was watching, listening, and he was angry. He was blaming Joran for breaking his beautiful, terrible creation. The thought filled Joran with a terrifying clarity. The abyss of the unknown sealed over, paved with the concrete of this new, unshakable theory. He was no longer a man losing his grip on reality. He was a combatant in a war of intellects. He was up against a rival, a fellow pathologist of the soul, but one who worked to create the diseases Joran was sworn to cure. He stopped pacing and stood before the statue again. His fear was gone, replaced by a cold, forensic curiosity. He looked at the branching, coral-like fingers, the opalescent sheen of the chest cavity. This wasn't a miracle. It was a symptom. It wasn't a sign of a god's power, but evidence of a man's failure. It was the most valuable piece of data he had ever collected. "I see," Joran whispered, the words a plume of vapor in the chilled air. He ran a hand over his face, wiping away the sweat and the lingering phantom of doubt. The face of the leader of the last cult, the one from the orbital station, the one that cost him everything, flashed in his mind. That man had been a charlatan, a peddler of cheap hope. This Kalis Rendor, he was something else entirely, an artist, a monster of a higher caliber. And Joran would dismantle his magnum opus piece by agonizing piece. He would find this man, this Kalis Rendor, and he would strip him of his manufactured divinity, exposing the pathetic, desperate human underneath. It was no longer about proving a theory. It was no longer about absolving his past. It was about dissecting a rival. It was about proving whose understanding of the human abyss was superior. He turned, his back to the glowing, silent corpse. His footing was sure now. The groaning metal of the arcology no longer sounded like a death rattle. It sounded like a machine waiting for a competent operator. His objective was no longer to contain a sickness. It was to hunt a man. The fanatical certainty he had momentarily lost returned honed to a razor's edge. He knew who his enemy was, and that was a faith Joran could finally believe in. The silence in the mobile command post was a physical thing, a pressurized substance that had replaced the air. It was broken only by the low-voltage hum of the life support and the faint, almost subliminal pulse of the glowing coral statue that had been a man moments before. The word echoed in Joran's mind, a perfect, clear imprint on his auditory cortex. Not heard, but delivered. You. Brecker Hoon stood motionless by the door to the interrogation room, his slab-like form a silhouette against the sterile white paneling. His augmented arm, a thing of polished chrome and bundled myomere cables, whirred softly as his hand clenched and unclenched. He was a creature of action, and this profound, impossible stillness was eating at him. He shifted his weight, the maglock on his boot soles thumping against the deck plating with a dull, heavy finality. "Forensic Vask?" Brecker's voice was a low gravel, carefully stripped of alarm. "Sir." "Your orders." Joran didn't turn. His gaze was fixed on the crystalline figure. It had stopped growing, its final form a haunting effigy of serenity. The faint bioluminescent patterns that had once traced the young man's veins were now a brilliant internal network of sapphire light, pulsing in a slow, hypnotic rhythm. The air around it felt cold, carrying a faint, clean smell like ozone after a lightning strike. The stench of wet rust and fungal decay seeping in from the refinery beyond felt a universe away. "It's not possible," his mind screamed. Sanity, his one true God, was bleeding out on the floor of his consciousness. Physics had been violated, biology had been rewritten. A human being had, through an act of will, become a conduit, and then a mineral. A radio receiver made of flesh and bone. And then, the second thought, the one that staunched the bleeding, the one that offered a lifeline back to a world that made sense, however terrifying that sense might be. If it's not magic, it's technology. He had seen schematics for esoteric bioweapons in redacted directorate files, nanite swarms that could hijack a nervous system, programmable viruses that could overwrite cellular structure. They were theoretical, forbidden, deemed too unstable for any practical application. But what if someone had stabilized them? What if someone had perfected them? The tremor. The city-wide groan. It wasn't a random seismic event. It was a trigger. A broadcast frequency propagated through the very metal of the arcology, activating a dormant agent in the cultist's biology. The chanting wasn't prayer. It was a distributed network synchronizing. The voice in his head, Kaelus Rendor, wasn't a ghost. It was a targeted audio signal, a psionic calling card left by the architect of this atrocity. Joran felt a coldness spread through his chest, extinguishing the panic and leaving behind something hard and dense. Certainty. A new, purer certainty than he had ever known. He finally turned, his face a mask of placid intensity. The frantic, cornered man from a moment ago was gone. In his place was the forensic theologian, the dissector of belief systems, now with a scalpel sharpened by righteous fury. "Prep him for transport," Joran said. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion. "Seal the interrogation room. Full biohazard protocol." Brecker nodded, relieved to have a directive. "And the report to the directorate? The cover story is compromised. A neurotoxin doesn't turn a man into a glowing rock, sir." "The neurotoxin story is dead," Joran stated, his eyes locking on to Brecker. He took a step toward the enforcer, moving from the sterile light of the command post into the grimy threshold of the airlock that led back into the bellows. The air here was thick again, heavy with the taste of metal and salt. A rhythmic drip, drip, drip echoed from a corroded pipe overhead. He gestured back at the statue with a flick of his chin. The sapphire light caught the moisture on his face, making him look feverish. That was not a victim. He was a weapon, a walking, talking, biological agent delivered to our doorstep. Brecker's brow furrowed. A weapon? Sure, he was just a boy, unarmed, nonviolent. The most dangerous weapons are the ones you welcome inside the gates, Joran countered, his voice dropping lower. He wasn't the disease, Brecker. He was the symptom, the proof of concept.
He saw the conflict in Brecker's eyes, the training, the loyalty to the hydrocorpus payslip, wrestling with the evidence before him. This was beyond metal hum madness. This was a paradigm shift. My mandate, Brecker began, his voice hesitant, is to provide security for your investigation as sanctioned by the Directorate. The mission is containment of a public health crisis. No, Joran's reply was sharp, absolute. It cut through the thick, humid air. He stepped fully into the airlock, the outer door's grimy port window showing the oppressive, dripping architecture of the refinery. He was choosing to leave the sterile bubble of authority behind. Kalis Rendor, Joran said the name, tasting its alien shape. It wasn't the name of a prophet. It was the name of an enemy. He's the bioterrorist who designed this plague. He's Patient Zero, the one who made that thing in there. He's not trying to convert people to a new god. He's beta testing a weapon that rewrites human biology. The chanting sickness isn't a delusion. It's the virus taking root, preparing the host for transformation. Every word was a brick, and with them Joran was building a new reality, a new crusade on the ruins of the last few minutes. This was a narrative he could control, a man he could hunt, a monster he could kill. It was the same pattern before, the same failure that cost him his family. But this time it felt different. This time it felt like justice. This time he wouldn't fail to see the architect for the believers. He watched Brecker process this. The enforcer's gaze shifted from Joran to the glowing effigy in the other room, then back. The logic, however terrifying, was seductive. It imposed order on chaos. It gave the horror a name and a face. Joran pressed his advantage, his voice a cold, hard instrument of purpose. The Directorate's mission was to contain a mass hysteria. That mission is obsolete. Our mission is no longer containment. He held Brecker's gaze, letting the full weight of his next words sink in. The low groan of Haven's metal skeleton seemed to answer him, a deep, mournful sound from the deep brine. We are not doctors. We are hunters. We're hunting Kalis Rendor, and we're going to dismantle his death cult piece by piece before he can trigger this on a citywide scale. That is the new mission.
He didn't wait for an answer. He turned and cycled the outer airlock door. A blast of humid, fungi-scented air washed over him as the heavy steel iris blown open. He was stepping out of the Directorate's control and into a personal war. The choice wasn't Brecker's to make. It was already made. The enforcer could either follow or he could stand aside.